Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, you just gave lie to the saying that a prophet has no honor in his own town, okay? I appreciate that. It is a real pleasure to be with this very distinguished group here tonight. I'm so glad you chose to be right here in Baltimore. I must apologize. I didn't realize that it was a black tie affair. I would have come appropriately garbed. However, we did have a power outage last night. There was a big storm here, as many of you know, and so we awakened to complete darkness this morning. I just went into the closet and tried to grapple for whatever I could find. So you're lucky I don't have a red shirt and a purple tie on. You know? At any rate, you know, telecommunications obviously has played a big role in my life. I can tell you, communication systems were a big part of my enjoyment when I was a youngster, because we used to spend many, many hours when we were ill or needed medical attention in Detroit's receiving hospital or Boston City Hospital, sitting in the hallways for hours and hours, waiting until one of the residents or interns was free to be able to see us, since we were medical assistants. That's what we got. But I loved being there, because I would occupy myself by listening to the PA system. Dr. Jones to the emergency room. Dr. Johnson to the clinic. And they sounded so important. And I would just be saying, one day they're going to be paging me and saying, Dr. Carson to the operating room. But, but of course, nowadays we have beepers, so I still don't get to hear it. But it's very nice, you know, to have those dreams as a young person, something to really inspire you, push you to achieve. That's something that we need to make sure that we instill into our young people today. They must have a dream, and it can't just be a dream of being the next Michael Jordan or being some rap singer. You know, it needs to be... It needs to be the dream of being the head of AT&T or Lucent Technologies or something like that. We need to instill those dreams in our young people. But I have to tell you, life came to sort of a shattering halt for me as a young person when my parents got divorced. Now, my mother was one of 24 children, and she got married at age 13. And moved to Detroit with my father, who was much older, only to discover that he was a bigamist, had another family. I remember telling that story a couple of years ago when I was giving a commencement address at the University of Utah. Nobody thought it was that strange. But I'll tell you, my mother thought it was pretty strange. So we ended up moving to Boston to live with her sister-in-law, with her sister and brother-in-law in a typical tenement, large multi-family dwellings, and sirens and gangs and rats and roaches and the whole 9 yards. I can remember seeing people lying on the ground as a youngster with bullet holes in their chest. You know, it really makes an impression on you when you see things like that. But you know, my mother was there working 2, frequently 3 jobs at a time as a domestic, cleaning other people's houses, didn't want to be on welfare, always felt that she could maintain some control of her own life, and that if she worked long enough and hard enough, that somehow things would work out. And her dream was for us to get back to Detroit, actually to get back to Deacon Street, where we lived before the divorce, which was small single-family dwellings. But, you know, these were like the little GI homes. And for black people in those days, to have one of those little things was pretty neat, you know. And, you know, I've gone back to the old neighborhood and looked now, and, You know, I wonder how any family could live in those little things. I mean, each of my garages is bigger than one of those houses now, but but at any rate, it was interesting, and that was the goal, to get back to that particular place. And you know, I'll tell you something about my mother with her third grade education and the hard life that she led. She never felt sorry for herself. That was the real key. And that was a good thing. Problem was, she never felt sorry for us either, you know, so and whenever my brother or I came up with an excuse, you know, it was not good enough. And she would always say, do you have a brain? And if the answer was yes, then she would say, then you could have solved that problem, and it really doesn't matter what anybody else did. And funny thing is, if people won't accept your excuse, pretty soon you stop making them. And you start doing what you're supposed to do. And that's something we need to teach our young people. Can't accept those excuses. Well, at any rate, her theory was correct, and we were able to move back to Detroit, still in a multifamily dwelling in a dilapidated area of the city, still with rats and roaches. And, you know, it was the kind of situation where, you know, these roaches were so aggressive, you know, and like, you know, if you walked into a room and you turned the light on, it was like the wall started moving, you know, with all these creatures all over the place. And, you know, not only would they crawl on the table, these things would crawl in your cereal box. So, I mean, if you were eating Raisin Bran, you had to know what those brown things were in the box. So, yeah, I probably shouldn't say that anymore since I'm on the board of directors of Kellogg now, but but it was an interesting experience. But, you know, there I was in the 5th grade, and perhaps the worst student you've ever seen. I thought I was really, really stupid. I had no respect for my intellectual capabilities, and all of my classmates agreed with me. And once we were having an argument about who was the dumbest kid in the class. It wasn't that much of an argument because they all agreed it was me, but then somebody tried to extend the argument to who was the dumbest person in the world. Well, I took exception to that, so we had a rather vigorous argument, but unfortunately we had a math quiz that day, and I got a 0. Now, I always got a 0. That was not a problem. The problem was on this particular day, the teacher had said, you have to pass your test to the person behind you. They correct it as I give out the answers, and then give it back, and then the teacher would call your name, and you had to report your score out loud. That was the problem. You see, if you got a good mark, it was great. You say, 100 or 95. But if you got a bad mark, you know. So there I was, and I knew when I said 0, they were all going to burst out laughing and say, see, we told you you were the dumbest person in the world. So I had a real dilemma on my hands. So I started scheming, and I said, I know what I'll do. When she calls my name, I'll mumble. And maybe she'll misinterpret what I said, just write it down and move on. So when she called my name, I said, 9. And she said, 9? Benjamin, you got 9 right. Oh, this is wonderful. Didn't I tell you you could do this if you just applied yourself? Class, I want you to see what Benjamin has done. He had 30 questions. She just went on and on, ranting and raving. And finally, the girl behind me couldn't take it any longer, and she stood up and said, he said none. Well, of course, the kids were rolling in the aisles, and the teacher was so embarrassed. And if I could have sat down, disappeared into thin air, never to be heard from again in the history of the world, I would gladly have done so. But I couldn't. So I had to sit there and act like it didn't bother me. But it did. It bothered me a lot. Not enough to make me study, but it bothered me a lot, you know. For me, it was still, you know, the greatest thing to get out of there and go home and play basketball, baseball, dodgeball, football, any kind of ball, and throwing rocks at cars. That was the greatest thing. Any guys here remember how much fun that was, throwing rocks at cars? You know, it was great because, see, sometimes those old people would get angry, and they would stop the car, and they would get out and chase you. Oh my goodness, this was the greatest thing. And we would run slowly to encourage them. And of course, then when they got close by, we were gone, you know? But, you know, sometimes the police would come, and they would come in unmarked cars. So we wouldn't know until they got right up on us, and they'd jump out and they'd start chasing us. And, of course, we'd be running like crazy toward the high fences. And these were like 9, 10 feet tall. And they would think they had trapped us, having no idea how adept we were at getting over those fences. We'd charge up to it at high speed, leap high into it, grab the top rail, let the momentum of our feet carry us over, drop down on the other side all in one motion, and laugh at them because they couldn't do that. Now, of course, that was back in the days before they would shoot you. Now, and then when it was too dark to do that, it was in the house to watch TV. I was what's known as a walking TV guy. I could tell you what was on every TV station, every hour, every minute, every day, all the jams on the radio. And back in those days, that's what they call it, jams. And all the latest fashions in any car going down the streets of Detroit, make, model, year, and price. But you know, that information in 50 cents might get you a can of soda. And you know, that was a serious problem for me. But you know something? It's also a serious problem today. It's a serious problem for a lot of our young people today. Not knowing anything. Not knowing anything of substance. You know, I have a program at the hospital, and I have 700 to 800 young people come in at a time. And I show them slides of the human brain and talk about human potential. And I talk about what I was like when I was a youngster. And at the end, I let them ask me questions. But sometimes I ask questions. And I asked once, I said, who can name for me 5 NBA players? No problem. All the hands go up, even the girls. Everybody can name 5 NBA players. 5 Major League Baseball players. No problem. Movie stars. Rap singers. No problem. I said, who can name for me 5 Nobel Prize winners? Only about 10 hands went up. I said, now leave your hands up because I'm going to call one of you. All the hands went down. Well, they didn't know the answer. They were just trying to show off. So then I said, well, this is the information age. Who can tell me what a microprocessor is? Of course, they were weary by now, so only one hand out of 800 went up. I called on the young man. He proudly stood up and he said, a microprocessor is a tiny processor. That's it. That's all he knew. That was the extent of his knowledge. You know, extraordinarily superficial knowledge. Now, where the heck is that going to get us? You know, in 1998, there was a survey done looking at the ability of students in all the industrialized nation to solve different types of problems. We ranked dead last in advanced physics, next to last in math, scraped the bottom of the barrel in most categories. This is a very serious problem. These were our top students, gauged against the top students in other industrialized nations. This is a very serious problem that we're going to have to find a way to address. And we're going to be looking to individuals like yourselves, individuals who have accomplished something on an intellectual basis, to begin to counter the notion that the only thing that is important in the black community is sports and entertainment. You know, why is it that on the front of every jet and every ebony, it's sports and entertainment? Why don't they have a black nuclear physicist on there? We do have them, you know. Why don't we talk about some of those kinds of things sometime so that some of our young people begin to imagine themselves in some other capacities? And if we have to put Michael Jordan there, let's put him on half of the cover, and let's have the head of the physics department at Hampton University on the other half explaining the arc of the ball as it comes down. I mean, we need to move on to some other things. And our young people need to recognize that there is more to life than lifestyles of the rich and famous. You know, the fact of the matter is, and this may be a strong statement, but think about it. If you were in control of everything, you had all the money and all the big companies and all the influence, and you didn't want to share it, what might you think about doing? Telecommunications. what might you think about doing? Well, I might think about engaging in some misinformation. You see, what if maybe we can get all these TV stations and magazines and things to make these sports stars seem like the greatest thing since sliced bread? Maybe we can get all these young black boys in Baltimore from sun up to sundown to be out there on a basketball court bouncing a ball instead of picking up a book and developing that. And you know something? When all was said and done, I would say, you know, that's every bit as effective as putting a shackle on their ankle and driving a stake in the ground. And I would know that I had succeeded. And you know, we have a responsibility to counter that type of influence that is pervasive. So when you guys get home from this conference, I want you to start by doing one thing. Get on your computer and compose a letter to John Johnson and tell him to put some intellectual people on the front of his magazine. Tell him just to do that one thing for you, and that you will be loyal supporters of him from now on. I bet if he heard that from everybody in this room, I bet he would do it. But that's the kind of responsibility that it's going to take, as well as responsibility in your individual lives. Well, at any rate, there I was, languishing, doing very poorly. My mother knew that I was doing poorly. My brother was doing poorly. She knew we were going to have the same kind of life that she had. She didn't know what to do. She prayed. She asked God to give her the wisdom to know what to do. Came up with the idea of turning off the TV set. And with all that spare time, we had to read 2 books apiece from the Detroit Public Library and submit to her 2 written book reports apiece each week, which, as you know, she couldn't read. So she would put a little check mark on it, act like she was reading it. We didn't know. But I'll tell you something. What a difference it began to make. Because we had to read those books. And some people say, how was your mother able to get you to read books? I can't get my kids to turn off the TV or read books or turn off the Sega or the Nintendo. I just have to chuckle and I say, well, see, back in those days, the parents were in charge. You know? And let me tell you, that makes a huge difference for the young people if they have a parent that's in charge. So we had to read those books. But all of a sudden, because I was reading all the time, when the teacher would ask a question, I knew the answer. I wasn't the last person to know something. I began to enjoy the sense of being the person who knew things. And within the space of a year and a half, I went from the bottom of the class to the top of the class, much to the consternation of all those students who used to tease me and call me dummy. But you know, here's what's interesting. When I was at the bottom of the class, I thought I was stupid, so I conducted myself like a stupid person, and I achieved like a stupid person. When I was at the top of the class, I thought I was smart. I conducted myself like a smart person, and I achieved like a smart person. What does that tell you about expectations? And this is one of the key things that we have to learn to do, is to create the appropriate expectation in our young person. Because when you think about the fact that we were made in the image of God, God is no dummy. So he gave us brains that were made in his image. These are the most fantastic organs in the entire universe, the human brain. It remembers everything you've ever seen, everything you've ever heard. It can process more than 2 million bits of information per second. Computers can't do that. It is absolutely spectacular. How many people here know your birthday? Let me just see your hand. Okay, excellent. Now, you were able to respond to that question very quickly. But what did your brain have to do? Now think about this. Now, I want to apologize to the lady who's doing the signing in advance for what I'm going to do right now, because I'm going to tell you what your brain had to do. Well, first of all, the sound waves had to leave my lips, travel through the air, enter your external auditory meatus, travel down to the tympanic membrane, set up a vibratory force, which traveled across the ossicles of the middle ear to the over and round window, setting up a vibratory force in the end of the, which mechanically distorted the microcilia, converting mechanical energy to electrical energy, which traveled across the cochlear nerve to the cochlear nucleus at the pontomedullary junction, from there to the superior olivary nucleus, ascending bilaterally up the brainstem to the lateral meniscus to the inferior colliculus and to the lateral geniculate nucleus, across the thalamic radiations to the posterior temporal lobes to begin the auditory processing, from there to the frontal lobes, coming down the tract of Victor Jour, retrieving the memory from the medial hippocampal structure and the mammary bodies back to the frontal lobes to start the motor response at the bed cell level, coming down the cortical spinal tract, across the internal capsule into the cerebral peduncle, descending down to the cervical medullary decussation, into the spinal cord gray matter, synapsing there, going out to the neuromuscular junction, stimulating the nerve and the muscle, so you could raise your hand. And that, of course, is the simplified version of what your brain had to do. I don't want to get into all the complexities. We've been here all night. But, you know, your brain could do that and multiple more complex things, and you barely have to think about it. So can you imagine what the brain can do if you put some thought into it? Think about that. So a brain like that, why should the words "I can't" be uttered from our mouths? And yet, look what is happening in our society and in our community. The fastest growing industry in our nation right now is the prison industry. Think about that. And who do you think is in those prisons? Our young men. That's right. In fact, have you heard the saying that young black male in America is an endangered species? Let me see your hand if you've heard that. Yeah, just about all of you have. Why do they say that? Because there are more young black males in jail than there are in college. The homicide rates are astronomical. It is an absolute crisis in our society today. That's where we are. And yet, why? You look at that young man, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, they're good students just like everybody else. Then as they start getting into higher grades, something starts to happen. That peer pressure begins to become very, very strong. And then they start reading about this great nation of ours in their history book. And this is a great nation, don't let anybody tell you any differently. But they notice that there's nobody who looks like them who contributed to the development of this great nation. And they start to wonder, where do I fit in? Well, maybe next year when I take world history, they say. But the same thing happens. Where do I fit in? And they come home, they turn the TV on. There I am, playing basketball, football, baseball, rapping in those baggy pants, acting a fool on some sick comedy. You begin to develop certain images of yourself, images that are not correct. You know, even on the TV shows that are, quote, good, you get some of the wrong images. Remember how happy everybody was with the Cosby Show? Finally, you know, some reasonable black people in starring roles on TV. I want you to think about some subtle thing here. Here you have an obstetrician, gynecologist, married to a lawyer. Now, did you see the house they live in? I mean, that could be next door to Archie Bunker's house. Now, when you watch television and you see a white physician married to a lawyer, you have to drive through the gate, past the fountain, up into this big column mansion. Now, then the next show that comes on, Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, now you see the rap singers and all these people getting on their private jets and on the yachts. There's a subtle message there. It's saying, yeah, go ahead and get your degrees and develop yourself intellectually, but you're not going anywhere. And see, that is absolutely false. That is not the way it is. We have to find ways to counter that. You know, I am not ashamed of the fact that I travel around on corporate jets. I'm not ashamed of the fact that I have a very big house and 6 cars and all these things. See, because they were all earned earnestly with this. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. And I'm very happy to tell young people that, because I want them to understand that you don't have to be a movie star or a basketball player to do well in this society. Now, I'm going to say something else about that momentarily. But At any rate, back to these young black males. They began to see themselves in a certain light. But you know, by the time they realize they're not going to be the next Michael Jordan or the next whoever the rap singers are today, it's kind of too late. They've neglected their studies. They're not going to be a star. What's left? Up drives this big black BMW with tinted glass. Out steps this tall guy with furs and jewels and women. Say, you want to be like me? I can show you how to get all of this stuff. Besides that, the society of yours owes you something. And I'm not making excuses for some of the heinous crimes we see and some of the lives we see led, but just providing some insight into how it happens. And the real criminal thing here is that it didn't have to happen. You see, because anybody, regardless of their race, could have taken that young man when he was 6 years old and walked down the streets of any major city in our country and given him a black history lesson he would have never forgotten, that would have thrilled his soul. They could have started by pointing to his shoes and saying it was Jan Matzliger, a black man who invented the automatic shoe lasting machine, revolutionized the shoe industry throughout the world. And he steps into that clean street and you tell him it was Charles Brooks, a black man who invented the automatic street sweeper, those machines with the big brushes, and down that street comes one of those refrigerated trucks, and you can tell him it was Frederick Jones, a black man who invented the refrigeration system for trucks, later adopted for airplanes, trains, and boats. And it stops at a red light. You can tell it was Garrett Morgan, a black man who invented the traffic signal. And while you're talking about that, you can tell him how he also invented the gas mask, saved lots of lives during the war. And while you're talking about the war, Henrietta Bradbury, a black woman who invented the underwater cannon, made it possible to launch torpedoes from submarine. And a beautiful black woman's walking down the street. A black man did not invent her, but you can use that opportunity to talk about Madam C.J. Walker, okay? A black woman who invented cosmetic products for women of dark complexion, was the first woman of any nationality in the United States to become a millionaire on her own efforts. And you walk past the hospital, you talk about Charles Drew and his contributions to blood banking, understanding of blood plasma. Daniel Hale Williams, the first successful open heart surgery in the world, had an operative mortality of less than 1.5%. Look up at the surgical light. Thomas Edison, you didn't know he was black, did you? Said it only takes a drop. No, but no, actually he wasn't. But his right-hand man, Lewis Latimer, was black. And Lewis Latimer came up with the filament that made the light bulb work for more than a few days. Lewis Latimer diagrammed the telephone for Alexander Graham Bell. Lewis Latimer pioneered work in incandescent and fluorescent lighting, was a tremendous inventor. Most people never heard of him. Walk by the railroad tracks, you can talk about Andrew Beard, the automatic railroad car coupler, the Jenny coupler, spurred on the Industrial Revolution. Elijah McCoy, the automatic lubrication system for locomotive engines. In fact, Elijah McCoy had so many great inventions. When something new would come out, people would say, is that a McCoy? Is that the real McCoy? That's where the term the real McCoy comes from. You got racist people walking around talking about the real McCoy, don't even know who they're paying homage to. So, and I'm just barely scratching the surface so you can see that young man never had a reason to believe that his ancestors did not contribute mightily to the development of our nation. And that young man needs to feel that he is a major part of this nation, because this nation belongs to all of us. And one of the things that we have to recognize as a nation is that although all of our ancestors may have come over here on different boats, we're all in the same boat now. And if part of the boat sinks, the rest of it goes down too. So we have to become concerned about each other and live up to the creed of this great nation. Well, there's a lot of other things I have to say. I'm not going to say them because somebody keeps flashing up these little cards that say you only got 2 minutes left. So I'm going to skip over those things. But I do want to close by talking about something that is very important, and that is success. I alluded to this a little earlier when I was talking about houses and cars and corporate jets. But that's not what success is all about. Success is about multiplying your talents. And I'll give you an example. In 1997, I was asked to come to South Africa to head up a team in an attempt to separate Siamese twins that were joined at the top of the head, something we call type 2 vertical craniopagus. These twins were from Zambia, and the operation was going to be done at Medunsa, the Medical University of Medunsa, the major black teaching hospital in South Africa. Always the stepchild to the University of Cape Town, where Christian Barnard was from, and the University of Johannesburg, always with an inferiority complex. But the possibility of doing this complex operation at that hospital was going to allow them to stand shoulder to shoulder with the big boys, because there had been 13 attempts to separate type 2 craniopagus before, none of which had been successful. Well, you know, I knew this was going to be a great medical challenge, but I didn't fully understand until I got there the social implications, how much actual social pressure there was for success here. So I prayed and I said, Lord, you know, there's a lot more here than meets the eye. And you need to show me something that will work here, because more capable people than me have tried this and have failed. And as I studied those angiograms, I noticed that the drainage system that they shared was a little narrower right in the middle than it was on either end. And I felt strongly impressed that instead of doing what is traditionally advocated in that case, as late as 1997, in all the standard neurosurgical texts, it says, if you ever run across a case like that, you have to decide which twin to give the drainage system to and disconnect the other one over the course of 3 or 4 operations with the hope that that one will develop collateral circulation and subsequently be able to survive. But I felt that we could divide it right in the middle and give them both an immediate drainage system, that the blood flow would appropriately reverse itself, and that they would both be able to survive. And I explained that to the team, and they said, you're the boss. We're going to do what you want to do. Well, I was very encouraged when I went into that operating room early that Tuesday morning. It was a couple of days before New Year's, 1998. And there was a big sign over the operating room that said, God bless Joseph and Luca Banda. And they were having prayer meeting and song service. And I said, yes. And I said, bring in a stereo system so we can play inspirational music through the operation. Well, 19 hours into the operation, we were only 3/4 of the way completed with the separation. And the part that remained appeared to be impossible. The blood vessels were engorged, they were tangled, they were adhesed. I thought back to the Bender twins that we did here in 1987 and how complex that was, and how we used 60 units of blood, and another set of twins where we used 80 units of blood. And as I looked at those vessels, I said, there's not enough blood in South Africa if we get into them. We stopped the operation. We had a conference. We talked about it. I said, we ought to close over what we have here. Maybe over the course of months, they will develop some collateral vessels, and then we can come back and cut through these and they'll survive. And the doctors from South Africa and Zambia said, Dr. Carson, I know you could do that at Johns Hopkins, but we don't have the ability to keep partially separated twins alive. We have to go for broke, regardless of what happens. Now I really felt the weight of the world on my shoulders as I went back in there. I didn't have my $350,000 Zeiss operating microscope. I didn't have my $400,000 3D wands, my lasers, my ultrasounds, all of my fancy equipment. I had a scalpel, I had my loops, and I had God. And I went in there and said, Lord, it's up to you. I said, I'm at the end of my capacity. Make a long story short, after 28 hours, we were finished. We only used 4 units of blood. One of those little twins opened his eyes right there in the operating room and reached for the tube. The other one was doing the same thing. By the time we got back to the intensive care unit, within 2 days, they were extubated. Within 3 days, they were eating. Within 2 weeks, they were crawling around perfectly normal. But you know, that's not the success. The success you would only recognize if you were there. You see, the people were ecstatic. Their level of self-esteem was so high, we literally could not walk down the halls. We couldn't walk through the streets. They were jumping for joy. It was wonderful. And you see, that's what real success is taking the talents that God has given you, multiplying those talents so that you can use them to elevate other people. And that's what we have to realize. You all have all been successful. You're successful to be here. We need to take that talent and multiply it. And as we multiply it, let's remember one very important thing. We live in a nation where people don't like anymore to talk about what made us great. They don't like to talk about God anymore. You see, they'd say, you're not supposed to talk about God in public. Somehow that violates the whole concept of separation of church and state. Anybody who says that is a moron, as far as I'm concerned. Because, think about it. The preamble to our Constitution talks about certain inalienable rights that our Creator, also known as God, gave us. The Pledge of Allegiance to our flag says we are one nation under God. Almost every courtroom in the land on the wall somewhere it says, in God we trust. Every coin in our pocket, every bill in our wallet says, in God we trust. So if it's in our Constitution, it's in our pledge, it's in our courts, and it's on our money, but we're not supposed to talk about it. What is that? In medicine, we call it schizophrenia. And doesn't it explain a lot of what's going on in our society today? So as we go forth from this wonderful conference, let's go forth with the notion that it's okay to live by godly principles, of loving your neighbor, of caring about your fellow man, of developing your God-given talents to their utmost, of having values and standards, of standing for something. And you know, if we do that, I guarantee you, we will truly have one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much.